Thank you, Alex. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me to take part. I guess my first job is to prevent postprandial torpor. And for the benefit of those for whom English is not the first language, that means I have to stop you from falling asleep after a good lunch. So I will try to do that. You heard about genotoxicity. Genotoxicity was mentioned several times yesterday. So we are going to spend this session discussing it in some more detail. There will be two talks. Maria Donna is going to give a fairly detailed discussion with only sort of 40 minutes available to her. It's not going to be possible to go into great detail, but she's going to discuss in much more detail the genotoxicity data with TiO2, in particular with nanoparticles. But we wanted to begin the session with a discussion of how genotoxicity results impact on carcinogen classification. We invited people from ECHA and IARC to come and give their thoughts on this, but unfortunately they were not able to do so. I requested some slides because I've sat in presentations given by people from ECHA and IARC at conferences, asked if I could borrow some of the slides, and unfortunately that didn't happen either. So I'm going to present to you my interpretation of how the process works, how genotoxicity results impact on carcinogen classification, based on the documents that are available on the ECHA and IARC websites. What I'm then going to do is try to interpret those descriptions of process in terms, and this will become slightly provocative, in terms of what I think should be done, and then based on a couple of personal experiences, what I think actually is being done. So to begin with my interpretation of what the documents on the various websites say, one important thing to note is that both ECHA and IARC base carcinogen classification on two key parameters: the strength of the evidence of the available data, together with considerations of all other relevant information, which is the weight of evidence. Now, the strength of evidence involves enumeration of tumors in human and animal studies and determination of their level of statistical significance. In some cases, there will be direct evidence on carcinogenicity to humans from epidemiological studies, and you've heard this morning that basically there is no evidence of human tumors for TiO2 from epidemiological studies. So in most cases, the available information on carcinogenicity will primarily be from animal studies. And one key point is ECHA quite clearly states that they follow many of the processes described by IARC. So the next few slides are going to deal more with what IARC says. Now, although the IARC monographs in their title contain the word risk, their review, the IARC review, is to actually evaluate cancer hazard. And they specifically say that they do this because even when the risks at the time of evaluation could be very low, new uses and unforeseen exposures could engender significantly higher risks. So they, IARC, are concerned with identifying hazard. By contrast, the CLP criteria of ECHA tend to be more risk-based. For example, they will discuss whether a carcinogen operates mainly via a genotoxic or a non-genotoxic mechanism. They will discuss whether there is evidence to determine whether the mechanism of tumor formation in animals is relevant or not for humans. So IARC and ECHA can come to different conclusions. And as was being discussed yesterday, the separation in time between an IARC hazard classification and an ECHA risk classification may be a problem. Maybe it would be better if hazard and risk were being discussed in the same forum at the same time. So this has been mentioned a few times, but just for clarification, IARC have 5 different categories for carcinogen classification. Group 1, carcinogenic to humans. 2A, probably carcinogenic. 2B, possibly carcinogenic. 3 is not classifiable as to carcinogenicity to humans. And 4 is probably not carcinogenic. ECHA have 2 categories. Category 1 is known or presumed, and that's split into 1A and 1B. 1A would be a known human carcinogen based largely on human evidence. 1B would be a presumed human carcinogen based largely on animal evidence. Category 2 is a suspected human carcinogen, and substances that do not fall into either of the above categories are not classified. Now, this is a very busy slide, but this is from a recent publication by Martin Smith and colleagues from IARC on what they consider to be the 10 key characteristics of carcinogens. It's not clear whether these are presented in any order of priority, but logic to me says they probably are, and that those at the top of the table carry more significance, more weight in terms of a characteristic of a carcinogen than those at the bottom. I've highlighted in red genotoxicity. And something I mentioned yesterday afternoon I think I should clarify here is, according to recent discussions and a recent OECD document, all of these various genotoxic endpoints are not equal in terms of their relevance to the cancer process and the weight that should be given to them in assessment of hazard and risk. So, for example, DNA damage, so strand breaks, even DNA adducts are reversible, can be effectively repaired. They may not lead to any permanent heritable damage. It quite clearly states in the OECD overview that's been recently published that more weight should be given to irreversible genotoxic changes such as gene mutations and chromosomal damage. This is going to be important a little bit later on. One thing to note here is this statement at the top, which I hope you can read. Any of the 10 characteristics could interact with any other. So, for example, oxidative stress, which is down here somewhere, could interact with DNA damage and could interact with genotoxicity. That means that they are being seen as 2 separate pieces of evidence in terms of the key characteristics. But of course, oxidative stress will lead to DNA damage. So it's actually one process, but it's being given 2 elements of weight. Now, I hope you can see this. This is taken from another IARC publication by Cogliano et al. In 2008. Apologies for the yellow. This was taken directly from the Cogliano paper, but I wasn't able to edit the color scheme in it. What this shows is how mechanistic data and genotoxicity data is a key element of the mechanistic evaluations that are used within carcinogen classification. So what this shows is how mechanistic data can drive a classification both upwards and downwards. ESLC is evidence supporting lack of carcinogenicity. So what we have here are sufficient, limited, inadequate data in animals, and then sufficient limited inadequate data in humans. So for example, let's take the situation with TiO2, and I asked the question yesterday whether the animal carcinogenicity data are considered sufficient. So we have inadequate or no evidence in humans, so we're down, but sufficient evidence in animals, so we're down here. If there is then strong evidence that the mechanism could operate in humans, if there is strong evidence from genotoxicity that the animal carcinogenicity could be due to a mechanism that's relevant for humans, then you can drive the classification from 2B up to 2A, even higher if there is more data available. So genotoxicity data is a key element on finally settling where the carcinogen group classification in IARC will be based on the weight, the sufficiency of the evidence in animals. So, how is weight of evidence used? A single carcinogenicity study in one species and sex in combination with positive in vivo mutagenicity data would be considered to provide sufficient evidence of carcinogenicity. However, if human and animal carcinogenicity data are insufficient or limited, then other relevant mechanistic information plays an important role. For example, whether the substance is considered genotoxic or not. And this weight of evidence includes information on carcinogenic potential that can be inferred from in vivo and in vitro germ cell and somatic cell mutagenicity studies, from cell transformation assays, and from gap junction intracellular communication tests. So for ECHA, in general, if a substance is mutagenic, then it will be considered to be potentially carcinogenic in humans. Mutagenicity data alone are supposedly insufficient to justify a carcinogen classification. However, in some cases where only in vitro and in vivo mutagenicity are present without clear carcinogenicity data, a category 2 classification can be considered when factors such as type and quality of the mutagenicity data, structure-activity relationships, etc., are taken into account. That's pretty broad and pretty open to interpretation. So, what kind of mutagenicity data are considered as similar to what was in the IARC key characteristics table? Formation of DNA adducts and strand breaks, gene mutation, chromosomal damage, sister chromatid exchange, I'll come to this in a minute, aneuploidy, which is loss or gain of whole chromosomes, changes in DNA methylation patterns. And it is stated that greater emphasis is given to irreversible effects, but is this actually happening? DNA adducts may be repaired effectively, or may occur in non-coding regions of DNA and therefore not lead to mutations. DNA strand breaks may be effectively repaired, or may be lethal, and dead cells don't make tumors, and may not lead to mutations. Just a comment on sister chromatid exchange. It's a little bit disturbing that this is still included in the list of key genotoxicity or mutagenicity data, because there is no longer an OECD guideline on sister chromatid exchanges, simply because we do not understand the mechanisms that lead to the formation of SCE, and we don't understand their biological relevance. So, how are the data evaluated? Well, positive results from lower eukaryotes, insects, and plants are seen as being just as indicative of genetic and related effects in mammals as are positive results in mammalian cells. Genetic effects, so positive results in humans and animals, are seen as more relevant than effects in other organisms, but genotoxic effects in humans are notoriously difficult to interpret. As you saw this morning in terms of epidemiology, similar biomonitoring studies for genotoxic effects in humans are very difficult to conduct because of matching control and exposed groups, accounting for confounding factors, etc. On the other hand, negative results in selected tissues of animals treated in vivo provide less weight, partly because they do not exclude the possibility of an effect in tissues other than those examined. So you get a negative result, for example, in a bone marrow micronucleus test, and someone turns around and says, but you don't know what's happening in the liver. Also, negative results in short-term genotoxicity tests in vitro, for example, cannot be considered to provide evidence that rules out the carcinogenicity of agents that act through other mechanisms. We cannot possibly cover every possible mechanism, every possible mode of metabolic activation in an in vitro test. So a negative result may be questioned in terms of its relevance, its predictivity of what might happen in the whole animal or in a human being. So, because of that background, it is critical that expert judgment should be applied, and the quality of the genotoxicity data, expert interpretation, and its relevance is crucial in using these data in carcinogen classification. We recently published on the genotoxicity data on glyphosate, and we put some fairly detailed descriptions together of how weight of evidence should be applied. So expert judgment, weight of evidence, these are the kinds of questions that I believe should be asked. Are any positive responses due to extreme conditions, such as physiological stress, excessive toxicity? Are positive responses only seen in non-mammalian systems, except for the Ames test? We accept that the Ames test is a very robust indicator of carcinogenicity. But in non-mammalian systems, insects, plants, fish, etc., or are the positive responses only seen in indicator tests, which are reversible or where we don't understand the biological relevance? Do the positive responses exhibit non-linearity? Could there be a threshold, for example, saturation of detoxification, as is the case with paracetamol, acetaminophen? It has a detoxification threshold. Were appropriate tissues sampled and relevant endpoints measured in the in vivo tests? Was an appropriate route of administration used? And are sufficient historical negative and positive control data provided to verify the competence of the laboratory and to allow interpretation of the relevance of the results? That's what I and others believe are the kind of questions that should be asked in terms of an expert judgment and building a weight of evidence. But we need to be aware of the fact, and I appreciate this is controversial, that published data play a very key role. ECHA and IARC rely very heavily on published data. But many journals are reluctant or even opposed to publish negative results. You will find a reviewer will say, well, yes, I accept that this is negative, but you didn't score enough cells, you didn't look at enough endpoints, you didn't look at enough tissues, you didn't use enough sampling times. So publishing a negative result is much more difficult than publishing a positive result. And this inevitably leads to publication bias. Much research funding is based on numbers of publications, so there is pressure to publish. And it is easier to publish a positive result than a negative. So we get a distorted picture from the published literature. Moreover, published papers often lack detail. Often you find results are expressed only as plus minus. There are no data, for example, on individual replicates. there is hardly ever any historical control data in a published paper, and yet that would be required for a GLP study. But nonetheless, published papers seem to be given as much, if not more, credibility as GLP studies in these evaluations. Just a few words on germ cell mutagenicity, because this is relevant. And this is a class which ECHA use, and it's primarily concerned with substances that may cause mutations in germ cells and could be transmitted to the progeny. However, the results from mutagenicity or genotoxicity tests in vitro and in somatic cells are also considered in classifying substances as a potential germ cell mutagen. So it's not only germ cell mutagenicity data that's used in this classification. But importantly, the class germ cell mutagenicity offers supporting information with respect to the classification of carcinogens. So something which is classified as a germ cell or a potential germ cell mutagen, which could be based on a lot of in vitro data in somatic cells, would have an impact on carcinogen classification as well. So the germ cell mutagenicity categories, again of 1A, 1B, and 2, provide an indication that the substance could be carcinogenic. Where there is evidence of only somatic cell genotoxicity, substances can be classified as suspected germ cell mutagens, and this may also, therefore, have an implication for potential carcinogenicity. So, if positive results in vitro are supported by at least one positive local in vivo somatic cell test, such an effect should be considered as enough evidence to lead to classification in category 2 as a germ cell mutagen, and thence to potential carcinogenicity. It is not essential for this categorization that a clear demonstration of a germ cell effect or even clear demonstration of penetration of the germ tissue is required. Read across is a key element in the ECHA process. If a chemical has not been tested for carcinogenicity, it may, in certain instances, be classified as a carcinogen based on tumor data from a structurally similar chemical with which it is predicted to have similar carcinogenic activity. There may also be evidence demonstrating similarity in terms of other factors such as toxicokinetics or mutagenic activity. Such an approach should be based on a robust and transparent argument. But substances which are positive in vitro mammalian mutagenicity assays and which also show chemical structure-activity relationship to known germ cell mutagens shall be considered for classification as category 2 mutagens. And recently, cobalt metal was proposed as a category 2 germ cell mutagen and thence a potential carcinogen based on 2 sets of data which I will discuss in the next slide. So in the ECHA review of cobalt, there was a positive HPRT mutation result in mammalian cells with cobalt metal powder. All of the concentrations that were tested gave precipitate. And so it is highly likely that the cells were being stressed because they were being suffocated at higher concentrations. As was discussed yesterday, it impairs gas exchange, nutrient uptake, etc. A follow-up test was done with an extract of soluble metal powder. Now, this extract did induce cytotoxicity, so we know that metal ions were being solubilized during the extraction. And this extract was negative. It did not induce mutations. So, putting the 2 pieces of data together, you'd argue that the cobalt itself is not mutagenic, that this positive result with the highly precipitating concentrations was due to physiological stress. But this appears to have been ignored, and cobalt was deemed to be mutagenic based on those results. Then there was read across. There was a reprotox study which included some measures of dominant lethality, pre-implantation loss, increased resorptions, with cobalt chloride, not with cobalt metal, cobalt chloride. And I've had that paper reviewed by several experts, and they've come to the conclusion that the effects are likely due to toxic and not genotoxic effects. But Ecker saw these as evidence of penetration of germ tissue, and by read across, cobalt metal was therefore a potential germ cell mutagen. So added together with the in vitro mutation data, this was a serious consideration for them. In addition, in an inhalation study, there was an increased incidence of KRAS mutations in the tumors that were found in the study. We cannot tell whether those KRAS mutations occurred before the tumors developed, whether they were part of tumor initiation, or whether they occurred as a result of clonal expansion after the cells had become malignant. But it was seen as evidence of somatic cell gene mutation. Also in the Ecker evaluation, positive results from in vivo studies using IP, intraperitoneal administration, which is not a physiological route and is specifically mentioned as such in OECD guidelines, were seen as indicating somatic cell genotoxic effects, even though all of the studies, all of the in vivo studies by oral and inhalation routes were negative. And finally, a few words on glyphosate. To give you another example, in the IARC review of glyphosate, more than 90 GLP studies, almost all of which were negative, were not included in the review, even though extensive details had been published in an online supplement to a detailed review that Larry Kaya and I published in 2013. Positive results from indicator tests, such as the COMET assay, were given as much or more weight than negative results from chromosomal aberration and gene mutation studies. And positive results in non-mammalian species such as fish, amphibians, and plants were also given as much or more weight than negative results in rats and mice. So there are reasons to be concerned that the application of expert judgment, the application of robust weight of evidence assessments is in fact overcautious. So although IARC and Ecker stress the importance of weight of evidence expert judgment and that more weight should be given to irreversible effects, recent experience suggests that these are being applied in an overcautious manner, such as positive COMET assay results being given high importance, positive results by the intraperitoneal route being given more importance than negative results by oral or inhalation routes, and even some suggestions that the IP route should be preferred. Negative bone marrow micronucleus results being criticized for inadequate exposure, even though chemical was detected in the plasma. Published positive results with no quality assurance given more weight than negative GLP studies, and positive results in fish, plants, insects being given more weight than negative results in mammalian species. So in summary, the process should involve expert judgment in a robust weight of evidence approach. But if human or animal carcinogenicity data are limited, insufficient, or absent, then the genotoxicity play a major role, and whether evaluating data from the chemical itself or using read across, recent experiences indicate that irrespective of GLP versus published data, the nature of the endpoint, the test system, or the route of exposure, a worst-case assumption is made, such that any positive results seem to indicate that a genotoxic and therefore carcinogenic potential cannot be excluded. So that's to set the scene. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you for this very clear presentation. I have just two comments. In your introduction, you said that CLP classification is hazard-based and risk-based for IARC and ECHA, and I disagree with that. I think that it's clearly hazard-based for ECHA because as you can see, there is other further process for risk assessment after classification, and the criteria that are used to classify the compound Of course, the route of exposure, the mechanism of action are also important in terms of hazard and not on risk. So
Yes.
I disagree with
Okay.
that.
Apologies for confusing you there. When I was thinking of CLP classification, I was thinking of the final statements on whether or not there is a risk, whether or not this will be allowed for use in a human-exposed environment, etc., etc. Yes, you're right. There's a classification step that occurs before risk assessment.
And the other things is in the ECA classification, not for the other compounds, but for dioxide, titanium dioxide, for which we are here today, that I can reassure you that the proposal from ANSES was based on the whole dossier, not only on publications in international journal, that we include all the data and the studies that were made available to us. So it's then up to, of course, the stakeholders and the industry and to provide us with all the studies. But we not only rely on publications, and we take all the
I appreciate
data.
that. But did you use a robust weight of evidence approach in terms of the test system, the endpoint, the relevance for tumors, the relevance for humans?
Yeah, I will say yes, of course. I will not say the opposite. And again, for GLP studies, I agree that we have to take into account all the studies, and also publications could be used, but we give more weight on the GLP studies, and there is a scoring of the quality of the studies, and they are higher scored than the other. So of course we use weight of evidence approach.
Okay, one more intervention from the floor here, Mr. Krug.
Yeah, thank you. You raised a very, very important issue in your talk. This is the handling of negative results versus positive results. And we don't have a procedure for this. So this is why the 90 studies you mentioned are ignored. Because if you have only one positive result, one study that showed a genotoxic effect, that's it. And if you have 90 or 100 others that are negative, they will be ignored. So we have no procedure for weighing these things. We are not judging the quality of the study that shows an effect against the quality of the studies that show no effect. So we have, in toxicology, we have no procedure to handle these things.
Professor Grime,
I
I saw you reacting slightly before we go to the answer. Professor Grime, you had some hesitation.
Yeah, no, there is a weight of evidence evaluation, you know, and if there is only one and there are a lot of others, then at least one tries to find out why the positive one is positive.
Yes, and it's a case of looking at the detail. But just to comment to Professor Krug's comments, I think there are people who know how to look at the quality, the relevance, the significance of both positive and negative results. In fact, we see that on a regular basis within the pharmaceutical regulators. They have the confidence to be able to look at the data in a pragmatic, in a balanced, in a robust way and reach an overall weight of evidence conclusion. I think, unfortunately, there are people in regulatory agencies in other parts of the world who are able to do this. We seem to be struggling a little bit within some of the agencies in Europe. Most of the recent examples that I've found rather frustrating and difficult to deal with have come from EFSA and ECHA. And I have my own thoughts, but I don't really understand why some agencies can take a robust weight of evidence approach to the assessment, and in other agencies they take a very overcautious defensive approach, and as you say, latch on to the first positive result and say, well, that means we cannot exclude genotoxicity.
Yeah, but this is what I mean.
And with the microphone, we don't want to miss any of the argument.
But this is what I mean with we have no common procedure for this, because one agency is handling in that way and another is handling in another way.
You know, the problem is I am against regulations, you know, or guidelines. You know, one has to...
I think we will all remember that sentence from our Paris conference.
I say guidelines, you know, because it's always a case-by-case evaluation, and you know, the outcome then would be with such guideline if you have one positive and 3.2 negative ones, it is possibly negative, but it's still positive. And if you have 3.5 negatives, then it's ignored. You know, the case by case evaluation. One has to find out why a specific test is positive, and very often it's cytotoxicity or pH changes and whatsoever. This needs to be evaluated.
It's not a game of football. It's not a question of how many goals go in the net at either end.
Okay, Professor Lansdowne, and then I'll go to the other side of the room. Yes.
I was going to ask David, what weight of evidence is given by an epigenetic route of cell damage as opposed to direct genotoxicity?
I'm not sure that any weight of evidence is given to that at the moment, because I don't think we really understand the implications. A lot of people are asking that we should include some epigenetic measures in our routine testing, but we are not anywhere near having agreement on that.
Okay.
Thank you. I would like to come back on the question of one evidence positive and 1,000 of negative evidence. We don't have one positive evidence. But so the problem is, okay, this is the most plausible biologically mechanism. It's a non-genotoxic. But how could you demonstrate that it's non-genotoxic and that it doesn't happen that once it will not be genotoxic? So the question is often, and I believe it's really worse than what we described, not to count the number of evidence, but to have a weight on evidence on negative evidence, which you address through publication, but it's not just that. It's to convince the people that we have made a demonstration that we don't have this positive evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have time to go into it, but in the glyphosate publication that we recently made, we put a table together, which is based actually on an ECHA document, looking at the various endpoints in vitro, in vivo, and giving them negligible weight, low weight, moderate weight, high weight. And then we looked at all of the studies, and we applied those criteria to every single study, every single endpoint, to build a more descriptive picture. So this is not about pluses and minuses. It's a descriptive picture of what happens. Let's not forget that with a statistical significance value of p is 0.05, if you do 20 Ames tests on the same substance, one of those is going to come out positive just by chance, right? And we've got 40 Ames tests on glyphosate, for example. So the more you do, with normal biological variability, you are going to see some positive results. We have to dig into the detail and see, why do those tests disagree with one another? Is it the way the tests were conducted? Is it the concentrations that were used? Is it the exposures, for example, in vivo that were achieved? How relevant is the endpoint? Is the endpoint a reversible endpoint, such as DNA strand breakage? Or is it a permanent heritable endpoint, such as a gene mutation? Are we only seeing effects at the highest possible dose, where there is perhaps precipitation, extreme cytotoxicity? Is there a dose response? Is it reproducible? All of these questions need to be asked. This is a description, this is a discussion. It is not a football match.